actually six, though.
All right, good morning, everybody. We'll give about 30 more seconds, then we'll get started. All right, good morning. We'll go ahead and get started, try and stay on time. For those of you who don't know me, Mike Lipnick at UCSF. This is going to be a meeting of the Open Oximetry Collaborative Community Skin Color Quantification Subgroup. This group has, in various forms, met over the last year or last year and a half. And this will be kind of a first in a series of more regular meetings over the course of the next year. I'm going to give a brief intro and then hand it over to a couple of presenters who have some slides with data to share, and then the majority, or at least the second half of the meeting, will be some discussion, mostly focused on the topic of subjective skin color quantification methods. Just some housekeeping stuff. We're going to be recording the meeting, and we will post the meeting onto the Open Oximetry Collaborative Community page, so it will be publicly available. If I could request that everybody in their Zoom title, please list your affiliation name, or at least your organizational name, if you're here and can list that. Mute when you're not on speaking, usual stuff. And then if you are speaking, just quickly, for those, we won't do introductions, but please just say where you're from when you're beginning to make comments towards the end. We also, in the spirit of other collaborative communities, we may publish summaries of the discussions that are held during these meetings as well, just to try and keep track. We will share minutes with everyone afterwards. And then if you know anybody who's not on this call, please feel free to share. Anybody's welcome to join. This is an open forum. The people who have been invited today are those who have signed up through the website and expressed interest in participating in this specific subgroup. Overall, there are about about 200 members in the collaborative community who have expressed interest in various aspects of what the collaborative community is trying to do, which are listed here. There's a QR code to, if you want to read more about the collaborative community. And just as kind of a final thing of housekeeping, we're going to be launching a new collaborative community page on the Open Oximetry site that will help kind of better organize some of the resources that are being compiled, the meetings, other events that are relevant to the community but may not be hosted by us. So stay tuned. That should be up about 1 week from now. Reminder, these are the 4 subgroups. So this is subgroup number 3. Moving forward, this subgroup is going to be co-chaired by Dr. Jenna Lester from UCSF, Associate Professor of Dermatology, and then Leo Shmulyevich from WashU. So thank you to Jenna and Leo for agreeing to co-chair this and moderate these sessions. So feel free to reach out to them or to me with any questions or issues. This is the agenda for the next hour or so. We're going to hear from Wem on some printing considerations for MST and other general limitations of subjective scales. Leo's going to share some data that he and the OpenOx team at UCSF prepared on potential pitfalls with using MST without specific ITA binning. Then we'll have open forum discussion moderated by Jenna and Leo. So with that, I am going to hand it over to, well, actually, these are just some questions to pose in the background to be thinking about, and we'll come back to these at the end with Jenna. Should a subjective scale like the Monk Skin Tone Scale be used without any kind of objective targets? Can pulse ox saturation linearity be assumed? This is something that has come up. In other words, if a recruitment cohort does not have the full extent of human skin color accounted for, can we make extrapolations of the bias we're seeing in the lighter side of the recruitment cohort and apply those to the darker? That's a big assumption that is currently being made and needs to be discussed further? Is it necessary to have one person per MST category, which is also being considered for recommendations and guidance? And then just more generally, how specific or general should regulations, standards, guidance be when providing guidance on which scales and how to use subjective scales? So we'll come back to those. So with that, Wim, I'll hand it over to you. I'll stop sharing my screen and let you share your screen.
All right, thank you. I just changed my name. I'm Wim Verkruijsen. I work at Philips. Let me share my screen. And today I will talk about limitations of subjective pigmentation measurement methods, PMM. I made the presentation together with Mike Jeff. He's also at Philips. And let me just go right ahead to the next slide, if that works. All right, okay. So here we show the B star on the horizontal axis, the L star on the vertical axis, and that is a typical way to describe color values for skin pigmentation, as you may know. The blue ellipsoid, or the blue shape, is the well-known Delbino banana, as she calls it herself. That represents normal skin. But as you can see, all the numbers and dots, they represent colors measured from a printed MST scale. And apparently the spread in colors is hard to control because from the same chain on the left, 3 times staple shop, same printer model, same paper, we can still see 68, 69, 72. The colors, there is some spread. On the right, you can see the results for inkjet and laser. So in total, we have about 106 prints. And you can see that the spread in both types of printers is significant. In my experience, it's not easy to find good inkjet printers, and that is why there's this difference in number. So what is a color accurate printer? Printer manufacturers optimize on great pictures, and as Mike noted, a great picture is a picture worth your kid, no matter how bad the colors are, and I agree with that. But then we go to color constancy with respect to other printers. That is much less of a concern, neither for manufacturers or customers, and unfortunately, it is a bit of a concern for people who want to print an MST scale. And I learned a little bit about printers, and it can be confusing. You see a lot of terminology, dots per inch, 4 inks versus 13 inks. So not just CMYK, but also white, printing, cyan, you name it. There's so much to be understood and learned. In the digital domain, of course, color conversion, how to raster, stochastic rastering, or linear rastering. Calibration, you can write a book about paper, the same thing. It's glossy matte coated color, optical brightening agents. There's a whole story about to tell about paper in combination with printers. And also very often they claim all superior quality, premium quality, vibrant colors, and that's only guaranteed when you use their inks and paper. So it's also a business model that is behind it. And I just noted this one. I liked the expression SNR has dropped below 1 in the discussion about printers. That's the guy from Mythbusters, if you were wondering. So this is basically the start of the talk. The estimates of inaccuracies and imprecisions for subjective PMM, pigmentation measurement methods, and objective PMM. This is something that we shared some time ago already, actually. And then these were estimates from a series of printers. The 20% inaccuracy for the whole range of light to dark, and that still sort of stands actually, but we can improve on it. We will also talk a little bit about operator imprecision associated with subjective PMM as compared to objective PMM, and let's get right to it. Objective PMM are much more precise than subjective PMM. Even with the same printed scale, color scale, we find that 3 operators kind of agree, but you can also see that the imprecision is in the order of 8% of the total range. And those are the numbers for 3 different color scales. You can also see a little bit of operator bias. And neither the imprecision or the bias are a problem with objective ones. And this was a study with 6 light subjects, 6 dark subjects, 3 visits, and 3 operators. Now let's go back to the printed MST issue. We recently had a letter to the editor accepted in anesthesia and analgesia. It's in press now, so you may not find it yet. but basically there we reported that if you do use non-calibrated printers, you have, first of all, a huge overlap in printed MST grades, but you also find that dark swatches are too light. And that can be a problem because you might actually create a new bias if you include people with not very well printed or lightly printed MST scale. Because the colors simply are not what other people might have with a different printed MST scale. If you use professional printers, both laser and inkjet, we found that there is less overlap, that the dark swatches are darker, and that the other swatches have more realistic skin colors. They overlap better with the skin references that we find that are shown on the right. Some of them are real data that we measured on forehead, dorsal, and ventral arm. Some of them are Pantone skin tone swatches, and you can see they nicely overlap. And you can also see that the centroids of the printed MST kind of nicely overlap with that banana. So now we wanted to know, is further improvement possible? Because let me go back, you can still see that some of these overlap quite a bit, especially in the lighter skin colors. What we did was we created 106 prints with 35 printer models in total, and we measured the colors of these sheets with colorimeters. So now you can see that professional printers indeed do make a difference. Even now that we have a lot more prints than for the leather, we can see that if you use all printers, you see a large spread. And with the do-it-yourself printers, I think we can make a sort of a classification between good printers and bad printers. Basically, if you go to your office printer or your home printer, that's a do-it-yourself printer. And what I would call a professional laser printer is when the guy behind or the girl behind the desk says, just email me the file and I will print it. And don't worry, I'll do it. That is, I think, a big distinction, because if you realize how complex printing color is, you can optimize for the specific sheet of paper and calibrate. And then here you can go from professional laser printing, where on the top you can see quite some spread for the lighter skin swatches, but also for the darker swatches. This was a single experienced operator that created color prints with 3 different printers and 5 different printer types, and he found a much better separation of the MST categories. And that has to do with different papers have a different absorption of the ink. They create a skin color in print by combining the CMYK, the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And you can imagine that if the absorption of the paper is slightly different, the dots become larger, and the ultimate color can vary quite easily. And if you have an experienced operator, they can adjust the machine such that the color still is consistent. So now we also found that an easy way for users who want to print an MST is actually to select the paper, because you do not always have access to an experienced printer in your hometown or on the web. So perhaps paper is an easy way to filter and improve the consistency. On the left, we again see all printers, the blobs for each MST category. In the middle, we see all the papers with all the types of paper printed on with professional printers. And here on the right column, we have made a selection for only low OBA paper. That is kind of yellowish paper. Now, what is OBA? OBA is an optical brightening agent that almost all paper manufacturers add to their paper to make it look nice and white. It's a fluorescent molecule that absorbs a little bit of the UV light and then turns it into blue light. And if we see kind of bluish paper, it appears to us as very white paper. And we prefer actually low OBA paper. Oh, the word low is missing here. I'm sorry about that. We prefer low OBA paper because we have less worries about UV and ambient light during color matching. The colors are more durable because OBAs degrade over time. We have a better match with real skin for darker MST. And we have, most importantly, a smaller spread thanks to the reduced overlap of MST grades, which you can see here in the low graph. So we prefer low OBA paper, and it is kind of hard to find, but as you can see here, out of the 108 prints, we found actually only one paper without OBA at all. That's the indicated with the black arrow. All the other papers had, some of them had a lot of OBA, and some of them had reduced OBA. But we think that by simply setting a cutoff for the reflectance at 440, or by measuring the B value with an inexpensive colorimeter, and by the way, in the right most figure on the bottom, you can see that colorimeters are more accurate with low OBA paper, and they become inaccurate with high OBA paper. That is also an advantage. We think that by simply selecting the low OBA paper, we can make a useful separation and increase the likelihood that your printed MST will look good and will be the same as that of others or similar. And this brings us to the validation of a printed MST scale. We compared two colorimeters, one well known to some of you probably, the Konica Minolta CM700D. That's an expensive device. And we compared it to a $200 colorimeter. As you can see, the difference in the L and the A is very small. In the B, it is somewhat there, but still the color difference between the cheap or the inexpensive and the high-end colorimeter is very small in view of the printer spread that we have shown here on the right. So now let me come to this bit of a summary slide. Our proposal for printing the MST is print the MST on any printer, any paper. Should be no recipe for use only Canon or use only inkjet or use only this and that type of model, or even with paper. Anything that you can use, if it validates, if you can validate it, showing that the LAB values are within tolerance, then it could pass, and you can report the LAB values. You report the colorimeter used, and you could even throw away the printed MST because you have shown that you used a certain printed MST. And the only thing we want to suggest is that if you want to increase that likelihood of passing, we advise to use a color calibrated printer and perhaps a professional operator that knows how to operate it. And also you can ask for low OBA paper. That's natural looking paper. Sometimes it's called biotop paper or recycled paper. And then if you use that, you will have a pretty high chance that your printed MST will be validated. And the proposed benchmark values and tolerances we've shown in the letter. And they have changed a little bit with more data coming in, but not significantly. And that is essentially a little bit of evidence that this proposal might indeed work. So basically, this is our take-home message. Calibration matters in printing, paper matters, and validation matters. But also keeping in mind one of the first slides, imprecision remains quite large, and an objective skin color measurement might be preferred, actually. And I think that is the end of my talk. So thank you very much for the attention.
Thanks very much, Wim. Leah's going to be presenting next. I'll ask everybody to hold their questions until the end, just so we can make sure we have time. And I think there'll be kind of some overlapping areas. I'll go ahead and share screen, then Leo, you can jump into yours. Just give me one sec. Okay, over to you, Leo.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thanks, Wim. That was really cool. Okay, let's move into the data, which was very expertly by Danny Shen. So thank you to Danny for helping visualize this. I'll kind of walk through some figures that we made to talk about our perspective, which is that including ITA with determination of MST is important to do, and that relying on MST alone without any clear guidelines on ITA is potentially insufficient. So we have two data sets that we can present here. One of them is from what we call the clinical cohort. This is patients seen at the UCSF hospital as part of the EQUIOX study, where they're in the ICU, and if there is concern that they are hypoxic, an ABG is drawn and a colorimetry measurement is made. And this kind of enrolls all comers, anyone who comes. And then the lab cohort volunteers, healthy volunteers, coming in for controlled deoxygenation studies as part of testing of a variety of different clinical devices. So, in one case, we are enrolling whoever we see in the hospital. In the other case, we are actively trying to recruit people with across the full spectrum of skin pigmentation. You can see in the lab cohort, our MST-J category does have 2 subjects in it, but a very small number of subjects. Our A category has 1 subject, and the majority of subjects are in the DEF category here. This does point out some potential issues, which is it's a little bit tricky to enroll people at the extremes of the MST scale. In our clinical cohort, we have 0 Js. In our lab healthy control, we have 2. This is not a ton, and this is data. So it just shows that potentially there could be issues if you say we have to always enroll someone with a J. So you can see here some of the ranges that we see in our ITA values within each MST category. One thing to make sure to keep in mind, though, is that some of these ranges are impacted by the size of the sample, right? So our J in our lab cohort ranges from -67 to -72. However, this is from 2 people, right? Whereas the H that ranges in the lab cohort from +11 to -68, that's from 26 people. However, for the subjects where you do, for the MST categories where you do see a large number of subjects, or at least a robust number of subjects, there does seem to be quite a bit of variation, right? So in the F, for example, or the G, H, you have an ITA range that is all the way positive to very, very negative, spanning what the Delbino categories would include as tan and brown and dark. Okay, we can go to next. Yes, these are all measured at the forehead. So another thing to consider when we're thinking about is it reasonable to insist that there has to be 1 MST per category? There are some nuances about MST that I think we just all have to keep in mind, especially at the edges of MST. So what we've shown here is the published LAB values from Ellis's work, that we know what the LAB values are of each MST bin. And if you take a delta E, and this is purely Euclidean space, like a Euclidean distance in LAB, between adjacent bins, so the distance 2, you can see that it's pretty low. It's actually right around 2, which, depending on which reference you look at in color theory, is at the edge of what one would say is discernible by the human eye. Some people are very sensitive and they can see differences in color that are quite subtle, but typically, this is in the literature I've seen 2, about somewhere between 1 and 2 is the limit of detection. So what I would say this says is that 1 and 2, at least the perfect printed color, not necessarily what you print as what Wim showed, there's some tolerance there as well, but the perfectly printed color is already a bit difficult to tell apart. And certainly the most difficult to tell apart between all the different adjacent bins. And 9 and 10 is a close second. However, if you look at bins that are between like 1 and 3, 2 and 4, 3 and 5, the distance becomes larger, makes sense, and it's easier to tell those apart. So I think of the potential challenges to keep in mind if we were to insist on there has to be 1 per bin is that it becomes potentially challenging in some of the bins to tell adjacent ones apart. Okay, so let me go to the next one. This is just a little summary of what the various devices that we measured in our lab cohort. There are several devices that were measured, and we picked the 13 of the 50 devices measured because they had more than 24 subjects, and we have MST and ITA in all of those categories. The other ones just don't have enough subjects yet. This is using a lab reference oximeter. And what we've done here is we've asked the question of what is the SpO2 minus SaO2 bias at different oxygenation deciles. So on the left, you see SaO2 SO2 that spans from 70 to 85%, this gold standard ABG value. And on the right column, you see groupings of SO2 varying from 85 to 100. And then in the top, you can see if we bin by ITA, and in the bottom, you can see if we bin by MST. So you can notice that if ITA is less than -50, these people are objectively measured to be quite dark in terms of pigmentation. The mean bias, there's a positive bias of 3.72, consistent with the concerns that we all have as a group, which is that at low in hypoxic states and dark pigmentation, there is a potential for a positive bias occurring and an overestimation of true SaO2. And you can see that that is most pronounced at that -50. It remains at -30. If you -50 to +25, that bias is not as significant. As you go to greater than 25, that bias is not as significant as in terms of a deviation from zero. And if we try to kind of map it to MST values, a similar feature exists, which is that the most positive bias occurs at the darkest MST. So here we are looking at a combination of I and J. We see 3.25. If we look at H alone, we see 2.7. If we combine H, I, and J together, we see 2.89. So consistently kind of grouping those darkest MST categories allows us to see that positive bias in hypoxic states. When we look at the lighter categories, we don't see that. Okay, so next one are a bunch of other oximeters that were measured, and you can actually see that not every oximeter exhibits this behavior. Some oximeters, even in the darkest categories, show no appreciable excess positive bias and compared to between light and dark skin. So I think this kind of points out that we don't fully understand why some oximeters exhibit this behavior and some oximeters don't exhibit this behavior. But you'll see that in several, so like the middle top one, in the bottom left, the middle left, you'll see that the bias still does seem to have this more pronounced effect at the lower MST, the lower ITA values, the more negative ITA values, or the darker MST. And a big exception, of course, is this bottom right, where the bias is actually in the opposite direction. The values of the oximeter are underestimating and suggesting that the patient is much more hypoxemic than. Okay, so next slide. So one thing to ask is, do we note that if you just had patients from -50 to -25, or -50 and above, would you see the same effect? Do you have to really include really, really darkly pigmented people in order to see this effect? So this was one attempt to try to visualize that. We are grouping the bias by SO2 decile here, 70 to 80%, 80 to 90%, 90 to 100%. And you'll notice that the most pronounced effect occurs when we include our subjects with an ITA less than -50. In the more hypoxic 70 to 80% decile, we see a more positive bias. And that effect doesn't really seem to be as pronounced when we have ITAs of -50, of greater than -50. If we go to the next slide. And in this case, there is no control for the pulsatility index or percent modulation. This is just all the data is coming in. Although Michael can comment on what we do in the lab data to ensure consistency of data. So this is another visualization trying to kind of hit home that same point, where if you, let's say, include only ITA -10 and higher, there just doesn't seem to be an obvious regression line that pops out that says, aha, as we get more negative in ITA, our bias increases. This is for SpO2 85 to 100, the regression line, but the same kind of features as we go to 70 to 85 is what we're noticing. However, if we include ITA less than -10, then that regression line starts to take the a negative slope. So that's a feature that we're seeing in this particular data set. We can go to the next slide. So this is, again, now you go into the hypoxic data and you can see even more so, the more negative ITA you include, this more pronounced this effect becomes. But importantly, it seems like if you just include -10 and above, the effect is not as strong. And so we have concerns that perhaps this isn't a purely linear effect, that really you need to have a threshold of pigmentation must be met, at which point some oximeters seem to exhibit this positive bias behavior. And again, not every oximeter that's been tested shows that, but to elicit this response most clearly, it seems that including really darkly pigmented, objectively darkly pigmented subjects is important. Next slide, please. And so then the question is, what are the bins, right? I think one of the challenges of one of the nice things about using the Monk scale is we kind of all kind of have a gut feeling that if we include HIJ, we are including people who are darkly pigmented. And with ITA, what is the cutoff? What is the appropriate cutoff to take? So one proposal we have is that we consider the distribution of ITAs that we have found among our data set. We've collected data from both the lab and from clinical cohort, and among people who are rated as HIJ, we can kind of deduce what the distribution of ITA values is. And so you can see here kind of a histogram plot that shows you that HIJ seem to kind of have a center around -50 and mostly be less than -30. And so that kind of distribution may guide the bins that we propose. So if we go to the next slide, this kind of shows you a similar distribution for our ABC category, the lighter pigmented category. And here you can see that in the clinical and lab cohort, the 50% line of this histogram is around 44, an ITA of 44, with a range from, say, 14 to 62. Okay, and then the next slide will show you the middle ground, the DEFG, with an average value, that 50% middle point value, somewhere between 14 and 30. It depends on the, whether you're looking at the clinical cohort or the lab cohort. And then we can go to the next one. And this now shows you our HIJ category between the lab and the clinical cohort. And again, as we kind of could see visually with our eyes, you can see here that 50% point is right around the ITA. And so it seems to us to be reasonable to say that using that -50 ITA as a midpoint of the distribution of people that you've enrolled in your HIJ category would be a reasonable place to start in terms of the bins that we pick. And the goal here really is to say, the H category we've seen has quite a broad distribution of ITA values. You could enroll people in your H category and kind of get a bunch of people who have an ITA that is higher, more positive than -30, and assume to yourself that you've enrolled sufficient numbers of darkly pigmented subjects, when in reality, you still are failing in the same way that subjective scales have failed in the past. So if we can measure ITA and check the data and say, use HIJ, use the Monk scale. It's a variant scale. It's well documented. Based on the stuff that Wim showed, we can find good ways of having reproducible printing. But after you've done that, make sure, like FDA ISO, make sure you check from the manufacturer the range of ITA values. And those ITA values need to be representative of this kind of distribution, where half of the subjects are darker than -50 and all the subjects are less than -30. Okay, we can go next. So yeah, this was our summary of the means and standard deviations of the MST bins that we would recommend. And then we could go next. The point being here, this is just repeating what I just said, which is that because HIJ range is so broad, and because there is potential for human error with subjective scales, having that objective measure as a double everyone honest in terms of ensuring that diverse pigmentation is included in these studies is, I think, really important. The other point to make is we are not proposing an ominous, overly challenging, difficult set of ITA bins. We're not saying you need to have 8 subjects with an ITA of -80. You don't need 8 subjects with J, because that's not what we have been able to find in our own recruitment. In our own recruitment, we showed you, we have 2 Js. However, our recruitment does say that it is possible to recruit at least 8 subjects with a ITA midpoint in the HIJ category that is at the -50 point, and that you can have -50 plus or minus 20, and that is a reasonable thing that one can do. And I think from our perspective, these devices are going to be touching hundreds of millions of fingers and impacting medical care. So it doesn't seem to be too onerous to require that the subjects enrolled match the kind of histogram distribution that we have found in our own lab studies. So with that, obviously, these are leading questions that I have tried to answer with the data. But this is an open forum and one that's open to discussion. We're happy to take questions and talk more about the next steps.
Thanks, Leo. Jen, I'll hand it over to you if you want to moderate. If folks can put their hand up if they want to make a comment, and then obviously there's some comments in the chat. But Jenna, over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Leo, for that overview. It was very helpful. I'm happy to hear any questions. And we can also start with these questions that we have listed. So starting with this first question, Leo, maybe we could discuss this. And I feel like you've kind of already covered this pretty comprehensively. Should MST be used without ITA bins? I think we've seen how MST alone can span pretty broadly within an ITA on the ITA scale, and so I think at least for me, you've clarified that it's really important to have an ITA pairing for that, since it gives a little bit more meaning to the MST categories, and we don't want to be falsely reassured that we have recruited a diverse set of pigments when, as you showed in the HIJ category, someone can be greater than -30, which is what we don't want.
That makes sense to me. I think it would be great to hear from Ellis too, because I know Ellis has through discussions internally, Ellis has also advocated for using MST plus ITA, not MST alone. I think it'd be helpful for the group to just hear from him, to reiterate that publicly, clearly, and hear his perspective on that as well.
Ellis, are you there? Thought I saw you earlier.
Yep, I'm here.
Great.
Yeah, so I just like to reiterate, absolutely like Leo said in our internal discussions and me looking through their data, it's absolutely clear that I think we need to use the MST along with the ITA bins as a way of helping keep everything honest and to make sure that we restrict, the range on the extremes in particular to those who are truly very lightly pigmented and very darkly pigmented. And I think when we see these effects, particularly at -50 ITA in the darker bin, I think, that's a really clear and compelling case to use that as a threshold for dark on that end of the extreme. So absolutely, I think you should use the subjective and the objective. And the only other thing I'll say is, as I said in earlier meetings, these may tap into slightly different mechanisms through which we see skin tone bias in pulse oximetry. We don't really know what all the mechanisms are anyway. So it's important to keep both of these different methods on the table at the same time.
Thank you. I see a question. I see a question in the chat. I don't know if we want to, looks like Mike, you just were addressing some of that, but Jonas, I don't know if you want to ask your question out loud just to make sure that we understand it clearly.
Sure. I would like to just understand, and maybe I just missed an earlier meeting on this. what question it is we're actually trying to answer or what we're trying to get at. When we say, should MST be used with ITA bins or not? It, that's a question assuming a whole bunch of other things. And I don't know what those assumptions exactly are. If we're trying to find out, for example, the effects of pigmentation on pulse oximeters in FDA-based or FDA-defined calibration or verification type studies, then making measurements at the forehead is potentially not of meaning because the pigmentation level at the forehead might not match the pigmentation level at the sensor site. It'd be great to do it at the forehead if we're using a forehead sensor. So I just have a sense that we should more fully define our goals here and the exact questions we're trying to answer. And that will help guide us in figuring out whether MST or ITA should be used in conjunction with each other or separately or one or the other or what have you. And I'm not sure that either one is the correct tool.
So I think your question is spanning a couple different concepts. I think your point at the end of whether MST or ITA is the right tool to be using is something we can discuss. I think this last question touches on that a little bit. But as Mike said in the chat, we've been testing several different sites, and we have not been noticing significant differences between them. So to your point about whether the forehead is the spot we should be testing versus the finger, it seems like our data at least suggests that it's not much different.
Jenna, can I add one quick thing on there?
Yeah.
So Jonas, we only shared data from forehead. For all the subjects, we're measuring at 9 sites. So we've got forehead, nose, ear, both sides of the finger, fingernail, inner arm, sun exposed, non-sun exposed. So we have a data set that has all of this. We see that some of the sites are really hard to measure, like back of the ear. For example, we have a hard time reproducing and the fingernail, mostly because of the constraints of using the methods that we're using, not because there's not a color difference necessarily. We're also, for sun exposed, non-sun exposed, we're in San Francisco. Sun exposed in the foggy side of San Francisco versus non-sun exposed is going to be different than if you're in Southern California. So like there are, and the last part is we do notice a difference between like dorsal and ventral finger. Like our data do show that. So we do have a data set that shows all of these things that kind of, I think we all have observed. And what Jenna is pointing out here is between forehead and the dorsal aspect of the finger just above the fingernail, because we aren't able to reproduce fingernail readings very well. But that dorsal area of skin just above the fingernail, those two spots in San Francisco don't have a huge difference. And so that's why we chose to share forehead for this discussion, but all of the data we are analyzing and we'll present that very soon. Some of it we have shared already, but we will have a more comprehensive analysis. Leo, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, I wanted to clarify, and I apologize for the confusion here. The ITA that we reported in the data that was just shown was the dorsal sensor site. So what we're looking at is that back of the finger, right below the fingernail. That's where the ITA was measured. And that,
I'm sorry, Leo, you said below the fingernail. Is that proximal or distal to the cuticle?
It is proximal.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, if you consider like pigmentation in the fingernail on the fingernail itself, there really isn't that much melanin. Most of it is really kind of proximal. And light doing what it does, and we've talked about this in prior meetings, and I think Josh brought this up many meetings ago. Light will interact with that part of skin. So our intent is to do the objective measurement of pigmentation at the sensor site. The Monk scale, could be used, I guess, in any site, but in most of the papers we've seen is being used at the forehead. And so I think one of the advantages of the Monk scales, it's pretty easy to use, and it does provide some nice ability to bin people according to a degree of pigmentation. That's good. And it's convenient to use it at the forehead. Now, we've independently also tested ITA measured directly at the forehead and compared it to ITA measured at the dorsal finger, and noted that there's actually a really high correlation between the two, because both are sun-exposed sites. So they both show not constitutive pigmentation, but kind of like the pigmentation you get as a result of sun exposure. So I think that is the context around which this is being asked. This question is being asked around the context of, would it be sufficient to just use MST at the forehead as a surrogate for ensuring that you have diverse pigmentation among a group of people in a FDA validation study? Or do we need to have some other guardrails in place to ensure pigmentation? And I think our position at the, with Mike and all the people you've heard speak, is that we need that extra ITA guardrail. And I do think the ITA, when you measure it, should be measured at the sensor site.
I have one more question. One of the things I've noted is that the sensor site, when we're talking about finger sensors, can be proximal or distal to the cuticle, depending on the size of the finger, the model of the sensor that's used, and so on. And so if there is a distinct difference in the pigmentation in those two areas, you can do a study with a certain set of sensors, and it can appear to be, to show that the oximeter has no bias based on pigmentation. But in fact, if the sensor site or the location was moved just proximal to the cuticle, then you might get very different results. So I think that's an extremely important differentiator.
Thank you. I see a hand from Michael. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that there are a whole bunch of sensor sites used for pulse oximetry these days, and many of them for devices that are getting FDA approval are intended for hospital purposes. So I'm not sure what the exact solution is to that, but given that we have wrist sensors, chest sensors, and many other sites that I can't remember, that measuring skin color only on the finger pad might be limiting ourselves too much.
And Desiree?
Hi, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. Yeah, I was going to kind of say the same thing. We're kind of looking at our data in children, just because a lot of times due to various sizes and things, you may have to put it on the foot than just the hand, and also with small children, like it's going across the hand, which does correlate to the dorsal finger, but sometimes the foot is not sun exposed and there is a difference in color, but we haven't finished processing our data. So I was just wondering people's thoughts about that with respect to like a pediatric population where it's not consistently on the hand.
Oh, Leo, did you have a perspective on that as a pediatric dermatologist?
So I think that's a great point, Desiree. I think it's the general guidelines or guidance that we're trying to put forward is that an objective measurement at the sensor site is an important component to include when trying to ensure that the subjects that you're including diverse pigmentation, and that if you rely purely on subjective measures, there's a chance that that you may think that you have a diverse group of people enrolled, but then in reality you don't. And so the variation that people are bringing up in terms of sensor site and position, all this kind of stuff, I think only underscores the importance of us making objective colorimeter-based measurements at the sensor site, in order to very clearly demonstrate and share in a very transparent fashion what the estimated degree of pigmentation variation we have among the subjects that are included in the validation studies of that particular device. The dorsal finger was used here because the devices being measured were all fingertip oximeters. If the devices in the UCSF lab were ear oximeters or other kind of reflectance-based oximeters on the wrist or something, then we would want to measure the ITA at sensor site.
Thank you. Seth?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, it sounds like there's some other pediatrics focused researchers on this call. And my experience with skin tone measurement, especially in a newborn population, is that there's a significant maturation that goes on in the first months of life, such that, you know, if this group comes up with a sort of measurement of adequacy of cohort, you know, I think we might want to vary it for newborns. We've shown that there's a significant change in L value over the first months of life, and so I just want to make that distinction here as we go forward with our work, that the guidelines for adequacy of cohorts might be different for the very youngest patients.
I think that's a really great point, and one that we should definitely keep in mind. There is a lack of data that's published around how much do LAB values or ITA values or any one of these kind of objective colorimeter values vary in preterm, in newborns, in toddlers. I mean, this just simply doesn't exist. I'm excited to hear that you've been measuring it, and I think that'll be incredibly helpful to share. You know, I think that like preterm, for example, we've seen data before that they don't really have melanin developing yet.
Yeah.
That's a really important point. I think from the perspective of, you know, should the ITA cutoffs be different if we were going to be looking at a sensor that is only being put on the inner arm, only put on a sun unexposed site, or only put on, you know, the ear or something like that. That's a good question. I'm not, you know, it seems to me like that is there's potential policy implications of something like that, where you're essentially saying that you're allowing for some pulse oximeter to work over a narrower range of pigmentation variation because the sensor site is different. And, you know, could that type of oximeter be misused and tried to be applied in a site where people do have darker pigmentation, and therefore, you know, you get a problem. So in some sense, this is a policy, and I'm not here to answer it, but I would just say that we know that human skin variation, at least adult human skin variation, seems to follow a certain range of ITA values. If we want to ensure that oximeters work across that span of human pigmentation, including ITA values at those extremes, seems reasonable to me. But you know, that is just one perspective.
Go ahead, Leo. You can answer the policy issues. I'm happy to listen.
That's my cue to mute.
If you raise your hand, I'm happy to call on you in order. If you had something that you wanted to contribute now, we're happy to listen.
Sorry for my outburst.
We accept your apology. Did you want to add something, or
Sure, Sandy Weininger, FDA,
okay,
and co-chair of the Oximeter Committee. Where are we going? I'm trying to keep in mind I'm juggling several different constructs here as we talk about this. One is the difference between testing for verification purposes and real world performance of oximeters, right? And both are incredibly important, because we need to be able to know whether oximeter A works as well or, you know, equivalently to oximeter B, right? But we also need to know how these things work in the real world, and trying to understand, you know, I'm not a clinician, I'm an engineer, but I ask clinicians, how will you adapt information? How can I convey? Let me rephrase that. In the standard, I'm not guidance document, I'm standard at this point. How can we get the clinician? What information do we have to provide to the clinician so that they can use the device safely? Right? And what I just heard, for example, was that sometimes skin pigmentation, like in neonates, is changing over the first month or 2 or 3, right? And so I'm struggling with how to digest this and how to present it, from an instructions for use perspective, from a performance specification perspective. So sorry, I'm rambling, but I'm trying to figure out how to get a handle on this.
Leah, would you say that is more justification for the importance of having an objective scale, so that we know exactly where people land, regardless of how we think there's
absolutely. I mean, there's different there's a potential for chromophores other than melanin and hemoglobin to be impacting the pulse oximeter signal. There's, of course, people have talked a lot about the perfusion and there's all these various factors. There's people who've looked at the fit of the oximeter, the pressure of the oximeter. There's so many potential factors that impact oximeter performance. And, I don't envy the team at ISO and FDA who are instructed with coming up with rigorous standards to ensure that these things work in the clinical setting. I would say the focus of this particular group is the impact of skin pigmentation on oximeter performance, and how can we ensure that when standards come out that require testing and validation, that we include a diverse sample of people in validating those oximeter readings. And so if there are pigment types that are outside of the range that we know of, such as neonates or others, then that will be an important thing to, first of all, objectively characterize what is that pigment, and second of all, ensure that range, if that expands the range that needs to be tested, that range is included. But the work of this particular subgroup will not solve the issue of sensor fit, sensor pressure, real world performance, all these other potential factors that will potentially also independently, or maybe in some sort of interaction fashion, impact performance. But I see Kumu has had her hand up for a while.
Thank you, Leo. I just wanted to say excellent talks by Wim and Leo. Thank you so much. And also, can we get these PowerPoints and we can discuss that offline? My question, 2 questions, are given that sensor sites and pigmentation may vary, and your data came mostly from fingertip sensors, I understand, it may be more feasible to qualify MST assignment with ITA cutoffs at the forehead. For example, we know that, like you said, the dorsal distal phalanx proximal to the eponychium is, it correlates quite well with the forehead pigmentation. And we like the forehead pigmentation for many reasons. One, that's where MST was validated, but the face, but also it has a wide range of pigmentation. So would it be reasonable to extrapolate, you think, Leo, from your ITA cutoffs to the forehead when folks were to assign an MST value, that, for example, HIJ, that half of the assignment should be less than -50, and that HIJ should only be assigned if ITA is less than -30. So that's one question, if you could hold that in your head. And the second one is, knowing that the MST cohorts right now that are proposed by the FDA is ABCD and then EFG and HIJ. We heard a lot about really important details about the HIJ to make sure, because of the SpO2 bias difference, to have the ITA cutoffs, as you had explicitly said. Should we have ITA cutoffs between the cohorts? In other words, ABCD versus EFG versus, we know the HIJ already. Thank you so much.
Sure. I think in our slides we did show some cutoffs for ABC and like for the middle and lighter ranges as well. And I do think that's important. I think that if there are some people like I know Chetan is on the call right now who's talked about how this bias through modeling can be explained through the kind of people that get enrolled in the studies. And so potentially if the people enrolled in the studies are not they're not sufficient darkly pigmented and there's also not sufficiently lightly pigmented, you could have bias on both sides, right? There's nothing, the devices need to be validated across this wide range. So I agree with you, Kumu, that we should probably have these bins in all the categories. In terms of your first question, yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think what you're saying is if a device manufacturer is looking to validate at a site that's not sun exposed and therefore naturally, or let's say someone creates an oximeter that works on the palm, right? And we know that the palm, whether you have light skin or skin, the range of ITA values is very different. It's like, positive 60 to 0 or to negative 10. In even the darkest people in our own studies, we don't see very negative ITAs on the palm. And so you could imagine someone says, oh, I really want to make a palm-based oximeter, but I can't enroll a single person with an ITA at the palm of less than negative 50. And therefore, this is impossible for me to do. And so we don't want that to be the result of this kind of approach. However, if they measure ITA at the forehead, then they are kind of ensuring that they have diverse pigmentation represented. I think that's a reasonable approach. I guess I'm curious if other people who think more about this stuff will come up with kind of a counter to that proposal. I do think for sun exposed areas, the forehead is a good surrogate. For sun unexposed areas, it's not. How our goal is to ensure diversity of pigmentation, then looking at the site that has the darkest pigmentation on the body would seem to make sense. So that, yeah, I agree with what you said, Kuman.
That's really helpful, Leo. Thank you. If other people have comments, especially I would love to hear from Ellis, Dr. Monk, if you could give your thoughts on that too.
Sure, if you don't mind me jumping in line really quick to respond, Jenna. I'll just say I totally agree. I think this makes perfect sense to use the forehead, because if the plan here is to make sure we get truly darkly pigmented people into the studies, then you definitely want to use a sun exposed site, and that will be the perfect bar to use to make sure that these devices work across the entire range of skin tones. So I think this sounds perfect to me. Absolutely.
Bob, I see your hand.
Thank you. Yes. And many of the issues have been nicely brought up. But for me, having dealt with oximeters both as a clinician as well as trying to help guide manufacturers through the ISO committee and what is required for testing, I continue to have more questions than the answers from what we now know. So I'm wondering when FDA is considering putting out a guidance document when there seems to still remain so much ambiguity about matters of where the impact of pigmentation is being sensed and where it could be best measured, and moreover, at what point are the acceptance criteria for performance no longer acceptable for a particular site or device? So this is really a question, I suppose, for Kumu.
Thank you, Bob, for that. You articulated really well our challenges of being specific enough, but broad enough to make sure that we reflect the plane that we're building as we are flying it. That's why this conversation was incredibly helpful. And thank you so much, Dr. Lepnick, for having this forum that we can all meet in this way and contribute very quickly and dynamically. But I think what was presented here is really important underpinnings to qualify our approach. If I can just sort of summarize at a high level, we're not really changing the approach, Bob. What we're doing is qualifying the MST assignment during enrollment, which is really important. We didn't have this kind of detail before, and it's excellent that we have this. And then Wim's presentation on how to accurately, kind of come up with color swatches to make sure that we make the assignment appropriate. And also, I personally think one of the biggest, most significant slides was that SVO2 bias differences between, by ITA and by MST. That was, for me, an aha moment. So I think we have, our approach is just getting refined, is what I would say, Bob.
I think Mike had something to add to what you said, Kumud.
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, to this issue of like data are still evolving. Clearly, we're having discussion, and like even over the last 2 years, this has been an ongoing discussion. There's still not clarity around how to do this. We're trying to share some data, but I think everybody on this call would probably acknowledge there's still a lot of uncertainties. In light of that, kind of jumping to this last question, how specific versus general should the new guidance be? I guess is an important question. In other words, if the guidance is hinging itself on very specific measurements, there are pros and cons to doing that, and would it is FDA, is ISO considering drafting the standards and guidance in a way that it outlines kind of the essential characteristics for methods to define diversity of skin pigment, but doesn't back itself into a corner where using a certain scale in a very specific way, data emerge in 3 months that say that's actually not the ideal way to do that. And there's no wiggle room to be able to kind of correct or account for data in a timely way. Obviously, the downside of having something be too ambiguous is we could get into the same problem we were in for the last 20 years. But I do wonder if there's a balance that could be struck here where the wording is such that we do allow for incorporation of some degree of new data without leaving the door open for kind of being counterproductive. So just wanted to share that.
So Michael, just following that up, what would you suggest, knowing the data that you and Leo and Wim and others on this call know? Is there a change in the current approach that you would propose that FDA consider?
I think there are others on this call who probably could speak to this better than I. I know Jenna and colleagues have recently published a paper kind of reviewing subjective skin tone scales. But for the subjective skin tone scale in particular, just this notion of what are we trying to accomplish here? We want a scale that's reproducible, that has traceable colors, that when it's implemented, these issues of variability in printing and lighting are accounted for. Like having that be more of the method. And then if the monk skin tone scale at present, I believe, is the only one that has these traceable scales, or is one of very few. And so for that reason, it makes sense to provide an example of how to use it for this method. But if, let's say, Ellis or others revise that scale to better account for some of these issues in 6 months, that new scale can still be used because it meets the criteria in the standard. Or if a new scale comes out in 3 years, we don't need a 2-year process of revising the standard to allow devices to be compliant and to ensure, more importantly, and to ensure diversity that reflects the latest data. So I guess my recommendation would just be to change the wording a bit, or make sure that I guess I don't know what the wording is, but to make sure that the wording accounts for that, and then in addition to make sure that it does reflect this concept, which has been consistent, I think, across most of the stakeholders in this group and others, and is consistent with the data, which is no matter how good the subjective scale is, it is a subjective scale at the end of the day. There is possibility, if not probability, of conscious and unconscious bias. And that should be acknowledged. And for that reason, objective scales or objective methods must be used. Those may evolve. ITA is the example that we're choosing right now based on the evidence, but like those may evolve too. And so I think there's probably a way to craft the wording for subjective so that it accounts for all of those factors without leaving the door too wide open, and while prioritizing diversity of skin pigment and accounting for all the data that we have right now without backing us into a corner of saying, this is definitely the best way to do this, because I don't think we know that. But we know we can do better. So that I think would be the recommendation. And I worry that right now, kind of, and well, a lot of people have expressed this too, like perfection being the enemy of good here. But the pendulum seems to have swung a little bit too far in the direction of enough rather than good, even. Like we can do better probably than just saying subjective scales alone are okay. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mike. I think Jonas, you've had your hand up for a while.
Thank you. I guess I'm still struggling, and I don't know if I missed out on something earlier, but I'm still struggling with the question that we're trying to answer, the base question. And in trying to get further with that, I want to throw out a possible question and see if this is what we're trying to get at. What testing for a given pulse oximeter would ensure that it works equally well on darkly and lightly pigmented persons? If that's the question that we're trying to get at, then I think in addition to what we're working on today, which I think is extremely important, I think we have to ensure that the testing that is performed on darkly and lightly pigmented sites. Having read, I think most papers, if not every paper that's been published on pigmentation bias by various pulse oximeters, some of those papers, of course, written by pulse oximetry manufacturers, I could certainly devise a test that very easily shows that a given pulse oximeter that I know has a high degree of pigmentation bias would show none in that particular test, just by ensuring that the sensor site, the optical path, was distal to the cuticle of the fingernail. So I think it's important that we recognize what we're trying to do. And if I'm asking if I've got that question right. And if I do, then we have to find a way to make sure that we actually pass the light from the sensor through a darkly pigmented site and through a lightly pigmented site in the same study, or many thereof.
Jonas, thanks for that. Unfortunately, Dr. Lesser had to step away to clinic, but big thanks to her for moderating. We'll continue for a few more minutes as people have time, just since the discussion obviously is still very relevant. I don't know if anybody has comments that to Jonas's question. I certainly, my quick response, Jonas, would be, I think we're trying to raise the bar. Right now, there's no bar for ensuring diversity of skin pigment. And so we're trying to raise the bar. We might not get to the perfect solution, and there are a lot of ways to game the system. But right now, there are too many ways, and we can at least set the bar not on the floor. And I think that's where we are right now. So to your point of like, yes, it would be easy to conceive how a manufacturer could get around the testing that we're proposing. Yes, acknowledged. If there are suggestions on ways to try and improve that, or to kind of close as many of those loopholes as we can, please share. But for the one you just said, which seems logical and obvious, it would be very hard to corroborate that, right? Like if we said, for example, it must go through an area of skin pigment that is dark, we need you to prove, like, how would you prove that? I guess that'd be my question back to you. How would we prove that a manufacturer in their lab did in fact align the probe in such a way for all subjects throughout the studies that was going through the area of skin pigment that was measured? Are you proposing they submit like a video recording of all sessions that have a, zoomed in, like it's hard for me to conceptualize a easily feasible implementable.
Hey, Mike, can I hit that for a second?
Please, please.
It seems to me that in our original construct, we used MST to assure that our participant pool was sufficiently diverse and contain the pigmentations reflective of our population, right? And you know, if we conform to that, that is, we get the breadth of MST categories, then we should be addressing, I think, Leo's concern that we've got, you know, some oximeters tested on darkly pigmented, medium pigmented, and lightly pigmented. The corollary question that I wanted to raise was really one of quality control versus assurance. Are we considering, you know, using ITA to come after the fact and say, okay, this pool that you recruited using MST has the following characteristics, or are we going to use that up front to say, hey, the pool that you recruited isn't sufficiently, you know, diverse from a pigmentation perspective as measured by ITA, go out and get some more folks in the following categories?
Just from a pragmatic standpoint for the lab, just really quickly to touch on it, we're using the MST to help recruit. So we ask, you know, subjects to identify on an MST so that when we have a cohort that shows up on the day of the study, there's a reasonable chance that we're going to be in the ITA ranges that we think we will be in. We then confirm with ITA. And then I think Wim made this comment in the chat here, MST for communication. Like, nobody knows what an ITA is except for, I mean,
well,
some of the people on this call, I wouldn't even say that I'm an ITA expert, but like, if we're reporting to a lay user who picks up the device, and the lay user being a clinician, maybe even a patient,
well,
right? How do they know who the device was?
That I agree 100% that, you know, reporting out the performance is going to be, I'm going to look at a curve of bias versus MST and a curve of bias versus ITA, right? I'm going to see all my monk color tiles. So when I, as a clinician, I'm not a clinician, I just pretend to be one, pick up the device, I know how it's going to, you know, what it was calibrated on. I'm asking at the other end, you know, can we, should we? It's a, you know, it's a methodological question for how we're going to conduct these studies. Are we going to try to throw more subjects in because we didn't see sufficient diversity, you know, in our ITA? Are we going to use that? And it's the same thing with race too. Are we going to measure or assess racial self-reported race and say, okay, I didn't see all these different categories of race in my participant pool. I have to go out and recruit more now.
I'm going to put race into a parking lot for now because that opens a whole other set of issues that are not necessarily the focus of this, but I understand the relevance. The MST and diversity of skin pigment as defined by MST and by ITA can be done and should be done in these testing cohorts, both. If you only use MST, there is the possibility that you do not truly have a diverse representation of human skin pigment. I think that's the point. So, Sandy, does that answer your question? I mean, I think that's the argument.
It sounds to me like you're saying you must do both. You must look at your distribution of both MST and ITA a priori, prior to finishing up your desaturation study protocols, right? I mean, right?
Correct.
So that's more than just using MST, you know, as recruitment. Now you're also using ITA to verify that your subject pools is sufficiently diverse.
That's what we're saying. But I think an important point to make, and Desiree made this as well, is that if you were to perfectly enroll across the entire spectrum of MST categories and get, you know, 3 subjects in each A, B, C, D, E, F, G up to J, that will not ensure that you have a diverse racial makeup of your subjects.
Don't use the word race. We want to use pigmentation here, I think.
Yeah. So just because you have diverse pigmentation does not mean you have diversity in race or ethnicity.
Right.
If the FDA or ISO wants to ensure that pulse oximeters work across a diverse ethnicity or race, then that has to be a specific thing that is measured, and MST and ITA cannot be used as a surrogate for that.
Well, let me cut right to the chase. I mean, the standard and the guidance document are on the precipice of being pushed out. So we would like to harmonize these 2 documents, and we want to know what is this common approach that we're talking about. Because right now it says go off and do MST, and it has some categories, you know, 1 through 4, 5 through 7. And I get my letters.
That's why we were keen to present this data, because we think that
I understand completely.
If it says MST alone, then that is insufficient. And if the document conflates that diversity of pigment ensures diversity of race and ethnicity, that is also
it certainly doesn't say that. I mean, because all we're saying is pigment here. That's a much larger issue as to, and Ellis has schooled us on, you know, those correlations or relationships. So it sounds to me like you're gonna spit out a recommendation that says do MST as well as do ITA, and then let's take a look at that participant pool to make sure that it's sufficiently diverse and from a pigmentation perspective, and then we can do our DSAT studies or conclude that our DSAT studies have sufficient representation before I turn in my report to FDA or whatever other regulatory body. As opposed to just saying, here's the participant pool that I measured on.
Yes. What you just said is what we just said. Yes.
Okay.
I think
we have a couple of comments here. I know we're over time, so maybe to Chathan, then Paul, and then we'll see if we have time.
Hi, I forgot I had my hands raised, but I thought Jonas's question was well positioned, which is what exactly is the objective of the pigmentation assessment activity, right? And from my perspective as someone that models pigment in the epidermis, if you want to ensure equity in enrollment, Monk scale or ITA measured at the forehead is fine. But if the issue is you want to test the pigmentation of a bias of oximeters that are going to market, then I think an objective measure of the color at the site the oximeter is being measured is the way to go. And I think differentiating those two is really important to Jonas's point. So that's really what I want to say.
I just have a clarifying question for Mike and Leo. So MST at the forehead to ensure that we have a diverse pigmentation group within the study. But are you also looking to verify you've got the -50-degree ITAs again at the forehead or at the probe site? I agree that it needs to be measured at a probe site, but if you have one, as was mentioned earlier, if you have a probe site that doesn't span a wide range of ITAs, you won't get that -50 in that group. So are you looking at ITA at two locations that may be run depending on the
this builds off of Kumu's point, I think, and I agree with you, right? Like if you set -50 as a cutoff, that assumes a sun-exposed site across what we have seen the population of adults to have. And that is kind of a double check to make sure that when you're using MST for enrollment, that you are indeed enrolling people with diverse pigmentation. However, as Jean pointed out in the comments, when you're doing the analysis of bias against surrogate for pigmentation, that analysis will be against ITA at the site, at the finger site, or the sensor site. And so, Paul, as you point out, if you were to use the wrist or some other lighter pigmented area, like, that's not sun exposed, it would not be feasible to create a negative off because I don't think you're going to get there. So I think the cutoff should be around enrollment, because I think, if we step back and say, how did we get here? We got here because one of the issues with the current standard is it just says 15% must be darkly pigmented, or 2 out of 10. And there's no clear definition of what that means. And if all we do as a group is clearly define what that means, then we have already made a huge step forward in ensuring a more representative, diverse group of people are included in these studies. And that is important on its own.
Just to clarify, you're saying that, yes, you would want to verify the MST at the forehead with an ITA at the forehead.
But then measure ITA at the sensor site, because every device will have a different sensor site, and you'd like to use some sort of objective measure at the sensor site for analysis against for analysis against the bias.
Thanks.
So 2 different things. I heard at the forehead and I heard at the sensor site.
Forehead,
so now I'm not clear what the protocol is.
The protocol is for enrollment. You measure MST and ITA at the forehead, and as for whatever sensor site you're evaluating, you measure it at the sensor site.
When we compute disparate bias, we compute that at the sensor site. So
Correct.
For recruitment, it's MST and ITA at the forehead. For computing disparate bias, it's at the sensor site.
Yes.
Thank you.
So one more comment from Howard. One question.
Yeah, thanks. So I agree with Sandy's, concern. It's kind of like, what do we do now? Especially with the timing, and then what do we do in the longer term to kind of get to the optimal goal? I mean, I do think as a clinician, I think sharing some of the data, just being transparent with the data from the studies, I think clinicians can kind of look at that and maybe find a way to kind of translate that into practice. With the pulmonary function testing has just kind of been updated and fixed recently. And I think one of the things that we agreed on is kind of like just appreciating the range of uncertainty and trying to optimize, and that'll allow the clinician to really optimize care decisions for the individual patient. So I don't know, just more transparency and just, I mean, I think clinicians have been a little lazy. I'm gonna, just because we want to believe that this is an exact number, but I think, what the work of the group is doing too is to kind of educate and have uncertainty and a little humility and to try to get it right for that individual patient. So just, I don't know, that more transparency might be a way to help with the shorter term fix. So thanks for hearing me out.
Thanks so much. Thank you for all who've stayed on for this extended session. I apologize if there were questions we didn't get to, and happy to follow up after offline. I think that wraps it up, right, Mike?
Yep, we'll go ahead and post this either sometime in the next 24 hours. We'll post this and the slides to the OpenAct community page, and stay tuned for the next meeting. We'll try and follow up with the data that as we're doing analysis in real time. We've collected all of the questions that have been asked in the chat. We'll try and run those analyses as soon as we can and share those back out with the group through the community page. So thanks everybody for participating. Thanks to Leo and Jenna for moderating, and we'll be in touch soon. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks for putting it on and bearing with us, me at least.
Yeah, this was exceedingly valuable, and obviously is the first of lots more so that we can get greater clarity. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.